January 1967. Phnix Province, South Vietnam. A 5-man patrol moves through secondary jungle to kilometers north of the wire at Nui Dat. They wear mixed pattern camouflage, carry suppressed weapons, and communicate only by hand signal. They have been stationary for 11 minutes, watching a trail junction. No one speaks. No one moves except to adjust a sight picture or shift weight off a knee. They are Australian Special Air Service Regiment soldiers, and they are doing what they were sent to Vietnam to do: find the enemy without being found. Somewhere to the southeast, near the coast, American naval commandos are conducting their own operations high-tempo raids, direct action missions, riverine interdiction. The men are brave, well-trained, aggressive. But the missions are different. The assumptions are different. And in the closed world of special operations in Vietnam, a peculiar rumor begins to circulate that the Australians operate in ways that unsettle even elite American units, that their patience borders on the supernatural, that they do not behave like soldiers in a war that has become defined by body counts and firepower. The claim, as it has been passed down through veteran networks and published memoirs, is this: United States Navy SEALs, among the most capable warriors America fielded in Southeast Asia, were wary of the Australian SAS not as adversaries, but as operators whose methods defied the tempo and logic of American special warfare. Some versions suggest fear. Others use the word respect. A few speak of confusion. What remains consistent is the acknowledgement of difference, and the psychological weight that difference carried. This is not a story of rivalry. It is a story of doctrine, culture, and the collision of two very different philosophies of unconventional war. To understand it, we must first understand the framework within which the Australians operated, the missions they were assigned, and the institutional identity they brought with them from a different military tradition. We must examine what the SEALs were doing in the same theater at the same time, and why their paths, though parallel, rarely converged. And we must ask whether fear is the right word, or whether what passed between these units was something more complex, a recognition that in war there is more than one way to be lethal. The claim itself is difficult to verify through official channels. It exists largely in anecdote, in oral histories, in the margins of after-action reports, but the conditions that would produce such a perception are not anecdotal. They are structural, doctrinal, and deeply embedded in the way each nation approached the problem of fighting in Vietnam. What follows is an examination of those conditions, and an attempt to assess whether the reputation of the Australian SAS among American special operators was earned, exaggerated, or a reflection of something more fundamental about how allies fight the same war in fundamentally different ways. Nui Dat and the Australian Task Force framework. The first Australian task force established its base at Nui Dat in May 1966. The location was not accidental. Nui Dat sat in the southeastern corner of Phnix Province, a region the South Vietnamese government had effectively ceded to the Viet Cong. The terrain was a mix of rubber plantations, rice paddies, secondary jungle, and scrubland, ideal for insurgent movement and deeply hostile to conventional forces. The task force was small by American standards: 2 infantry battalions, 1 artillery regiment, an armored squadron and supporting elements. At full strength, fewer than 5,000 men. But the Australians did not intend to fight the way. The Americans did. Australian doctrine in Vietnam was shaped by experience in Malaya, Borneo, and Korea conflicts where patience, economy of force, and intelligence-driven operations had proven more effective than overwhelming firepower. The task force did not conduct large-scale search and destroy sweeps. It did not measure success in body counts. Instead, it prioritized area domination, saturating a defined space with patrols, ambushes, and observation posts until the enemy could not move without being detected. The goal was not to kill the Viet Cong in decisive engagements, but to deny them freedom of movement, disrupt their logistics, and erode their ability to control the population. This approach required a constant flow of intelligence, and the Australians invested heavily in reconnaissance, Every infantry company rotated platoons through patrol duty. Every battalion maintained standing patrol programs. And above all of this, providing deep reconnaissance beyond the task force's tactical area of responsibility, was the Special Air Service Regiment, the SASR deployed to Vietnam in small numbers. A single squadron rotated annually, never more than 120 men in country at any given time. They were organized into 5-man patrols, each commanded by a patrol commander, usually a sergeant or warrant officer, and supported by a medic, a signaller, and 2 scouts. The patrols operated independently, often for weeks at a time, inserted by helicopter into remote areas where they would establish covert observation posts, track enemy movement, and call in artillery or airstrikes when opportunities presented. Themselves, unlike American long-range reconnaissance patrols, which often operated for 72 to 96 hours before extraction, SASR patrols could remain in the field for 14 days or more. They carried enough rations, water purification, tablets, and ammunition to sustain themselves without resupply. They moved slowly, covered short distances, and prioritized concealment above all else. Contact with the enemy was avoided unless unavoidable. The mission was to watch, to report, to guide heavier forces onto targets, not to engage. This philosophy extended to the training pipeline. SASR selection in the 1960s was brutal. Attrition rates exceeded 70%, and the emphasis was on self-reliance, patience, and the ability to function under prolonged isolation. The regiment drew heavily from the British SAS model, which itself had been refined in the deserts of North Africa and the jungles of Southeast Asia. There was no room for bravado, no tolerance for noise discipline violations, no patience for soldiers who could not sit still for hours in the rain, waiting for a target that might never appear. The result was a unit culture that prized restraint. SASR soldiers did not talk about their missions outside the regiment. They did not seek recognition. They did not compete for headlines. And when they did make contact, it was almost always on their terms, quick, violent, and followed by immediate withdrawal. This was the framework within which the Australians operated: small, deliberate, focused on intelligence and economy of force, and fundamentally different from the American approach, which prioritized tempo, aggression, and the application of overwhelming combat power. But if the Australians were operating this way, what were the Americans doing, and more specifically, what were the SEALs doing in the same theater, often in adjacent provinces, at the same time? The SASR mission in Phnic Province. Phnic Province was never a primary theater for American ground forces. It was, by the standards of the war, a backwater strategically significant because of its proximity to the port of Vung Tau and the main supply route to Saigon, but otherwise a secondary concern. The Americans had advisors there, logistical units, and occasional sweeps by larger formations, but the province was assigned to the Australians. It was their problem to solve. The problem was D for 45 Battalion, a main force Viet Cong unit that had operated in Phnic since the early 1960s. D for 145 was well-armed, experienced, and deeply embedded in the local population. It controlled large swaths of the province, taxed villages, recruited fighters, and staged attacks on government outposts and convoys. By 1966, it had effectively turned Phnic into a sanctuary. The South Vietnamese government could not dislodge it. The Americans, focused on larger operations elsewhere, did not prioritize the province. The Australians inherited a mission that required them to break the Viet Cong's hold. Without the resources to do so through brute force, the SASR's role was to find D for 145. Not to destroy it, though fire support could be called in when the opportunity arose, but to locate it, track it, map its movements, and provide the intelligence necessary for the task force to plan effective operations. This required patrols to penetrate deep into Viet Cong-controlled areas, establish observation posts, and remain undetected while enemy forces moved around them. In practice, this meant lying in ambush positions for days, observing trails, listening to radio traffic, noting the times and directions of enemy patrols, and compiling detailed reports that would later inform battalion-level sweeps or artillery concentrations. It meant watching enemy soldiers walk past at distances measured in meters, close enough to hear conversations and doing nothing. It meant accepting that the mission was not glory but information, and that success was defined by what you saw, not what you killed. The patrols operated under strict rules of engagement. Contact was to be avoided unless the patrol was compromised. If compromised, the response was immediate and overwhelming claymores, grenades, suppressive fire, followed by withdrawal under cover of artillery or helicopter gunships. But the goal was never to initiate contact. The goal was to remain invisible. This required fieldcraft that bordered on the obsessive. Movement was limited to short bounds, often less than a kilometer per day. Camouflage was applied to skin, weapons, and equipment. Noise discipline was absolute. No smoking, no cooking, no unnecessary movement. Patrols would sometimes remain motionless for hours, waiting for a suspected enemy patrol to pass, or for the sound of movement to fade into the distance. Sleep was taken in shifts, never more than an hour at a time, and always with one man awake. And listening, the psychological demands were immense. Soldiers had to suppress the natural human instinct to move, to react, to assert control over their environment. They had to trust that stillness was a form of action, that patience was a weapon, and that the absence of contact was often the best possible outcome. For men trained to fight, this was counterintuitive. For men trained to reconnaissance, it was doctrine. The results spoke for themselves. Between 1966 and 1971, SASR patrols in FNICT provided the intelligence foundation for nearly every major Australian operation in the province. They identified enemy base areas, tracked supply routes, located caches, and called in airstrikes that destroyed logistics nodes before they could be used. The task force's ability to dominate FNICT and eventually to disrupt D445 to the point where it could no longer operate effectively was built on the information SASR patrols provided. But this success came at a cost that was invisible to outsiders. The patrols suffered from stress injuries that had no clear medical diagnosis. Men returned from extended missions with tremors, insomnia, and a hypervigilance that did not fade after extraction. The regiment developed its own informal support systems, understanding that what they were asking of soldiers to remain alone, silent, and immobile in enemy territory for weeks at a time was something that left marks. And it was this operational reality, this relentless focus on concealment and intelligence over direct action, that began to generate a reputation among other special operations units in Vietnam, because the SASR was not fighting the way other units fought. It was not competing for body counts. It was not conducting raids for the sake of raids. It was doing something harder to quantify and harder to understand. It was making the enemy afraid to move. What, then, were the SEALs doing? And why would their mission sets, executed in the same country at the same time, lead to the perception that the Australians operated in a fundamentally different, and perhaps more unsettling mode of warfare? Naval Special Warfare in the Vietnam conflict. The United States Navy SEALs arrived in Vietnam in 1962 as advisors, and by 1966 they were conducting full-scale combat operations. Their mission was different from the SASR's in almost every respect. SEALs were direct action specialists. They were trained to assault, capture, destroy, and withdraw quickly, violently, and with overwhelming tactical surprise. They operated primarily in the Mekong Delta and the Rung Sat Special Zone, waterlogged environments where mobility depended on small boats, helicopter insertion, and speed. The SEAL platoon was the basic operational unit, 14 to 16 men, organized into squads, equipped with a staggering variety of weapons: M16s, CAR-15s, M60 machine guns, grenade launchers, shotguns, and occasionally captured AK-47s. They wore tiger-striped camouflage, soft hats, and minimal equipment. They moved fast, they hit hard, and they extracted before the enemy could organize a response. A typical SEAL operation might begin with intelligence from South Vietnamese sources, signals intercepts, or prisoner interrogations. A target would be identified, a Viet Cong tax collector, a weapons cache, a suspected cadre headquarters. The platoon would insert by boat or helicopter, move rapidly to the target, conduct the assault, collect intelligence or prisoners, and withdraw. The entire operation might last 4 to 6 hours. Contact was expected. Contact was often the point. This operational tempo was a function of the environment and the mission. The Mekong Delta was not Phnic-2. It was a labyrinth of rivers, canals, and rice paddies, densely populated, with enemy forces that could blend into the civilian population within minutes. There was no static front line, no secure base from which to conduct extended reconnaissance. The enemy was everywhere and nowhere, and the only way to disrupt him was to strike repeatedly, unpredictably, and with sufficient violence to create a psychological effect. The SEALs excelled at this. They became experts in ambush tactics, prisoner snatches, and rapid raids on enemy infrastructure. They developed a reputation for audacity, for willingness to operate in areas where other units refused to go, and for a level of aggression that sometimes bordered on recklessness. They took casualties, they lost men, but they also killed and captured large numbers of Viet Cong, disrupted enemy logistics, and forced the enemy to divert resources to security that might otherwise have been used. Offensively docked, but the SEAL mission was not reconnaissance. It was not intelligence collection for its own sake. It was direct action, and that required a fundamentally different mindset. SEALs were trained to close with the enemy, to dominate the engagement, and to fight their way out if necessary. They were comfortable with noise, with movement, with the chaos of close-quarters combat. They trusted in their firepower, their training, and their ability to control the tempo of an engagement. Through speed and violence, this made them extraordinarily effective at what they did. But it also meant that when they encountered the SASR, either through joint operations, informal contact at bases, or second-hand accounts, they were encountering a unit that seemed to be fighting a different war. The differences were stark. SEALs rotated through 6-month deployments and conducted multiple operations per week. SAS or patrols deployed for months at a time and might go weeks without firing a shot. SEALs measured success in confirmed kills, captured weapons, and destroyed infrastructure. SASR measured success in intelligence reports, enemy movements tracked, and operations that never had to be conducted because the enemy had been preempted. SEALs operated in areas with heavy friendly presence and close air support on call. SAS or patrols often operated beyond artillery range, in areas where extraction might take hours, and where the nearest friendly unit was a battalion-sized sweep, 20 kilometers away. And perhaps most significantly, SEALs were rewarded for aggression. The Naval Special Warfare community valued audacity, initiative, and the willingness to take risks. Decorations were awarded for actions under fire, for decisive leadership, for offensive operations that achieve tangible results. The SASR, by contrast, rewarded patience, discipline, and the ability to avoid detection. A patrol that spent 2 weeks in the field, gathered critical intelligence, and never made contact was considered a success. A patrol that made contact and had to fight its way out was considered, at best, a mixed outcome. These were not just tactical differences, they were cultural and institutional differences, rooted in the way each nation had developed its special operations forces, and the way each nation understood the purpose of unconventional warfare. But if the missions were so different, and the operational areas rarely overlapped, why would the perception of fear or wariness, or respect have developed? What interactions occurred? And what was it about the SASR that seemed to unsettle even men who were themselves among the most capable warriors in the American military? Reconnaissance doctrine and operational assumptions. To understand the friction or the fascination that emerged between SEAL and SASR operators, it is necessary to examine the underlying assumptions that governed how each unit approached the problem of reconnaissance and direct action in a counterinsurgency environment. American Special Operations doctrine in Vietnam was shaped by the belief that momentum mattered, that the enemy could be kept off balance through relentless pressure, that the application of superior firepower, superior mobility, and superior technology would create conditions in which the insurgent could not rest, could not regroup, and would eventually be worn down. This was not an unreasonable belief. It had worked to varying degrees in conventional conflicts. It had proven effective in certain phases of the Korean War, and in Vietnam, it produced measurable results in terms of enemy casualties, disrupted operations and territory temporarily, cleared ***. Encounter, perception and professional comparison. * direct operational collaboration between SEAL teams and SASR patrols was rare. The units operated in different provinces, under different command structures and with different mission priorities. When they did cross paths, it was usually in logistical settings at the rear base at Vung Tau, during transit through Saigon, or at joint briefings that brought together allied special operations units for broader strategic coordination. But Vietnam was a small war in many ways. The special operations community was even smaller, and within that community, information circulated quickly, stories were told, missions were discussed, and reputations were built not just on official records but on the impressions one unit left on another. One recurring theme in post-war accounts is the impression that SASR soldiers were unusually quiet, not in the sense of being shy or reserved, but in the sense of being unwilling to discuss their missions in any detail, even with other special operators. This was partly a function of operational security. The SASR maintained strict discipline around mission debriefs, and soldiers were expected not to discuss patrol details outside the regiment. But it was also a function of culture. The regiment did not reward self-promotion. It did not celebrate individual achievements. Success was collective, and the measure of success was whether the intelligence was accurate, not whether the patrol had been exciting. This contrasted sharply with the SEAL culture, which was more open, more competitive, and more willing to discuss tactics, techniques, and lessons learned across platoons and even across services. SEALs talked about their missions. They compared notes. They argued about tactics. They built a body of institutional knowledge through informal exchange as much as through formal debriefs. The Australians did not participate in this exchange. They listened. They were polite, but they did not share. And to American operators accustomed to a certain level of professional camaraderie, this silence was, at times, disconcerting. There are also accounts again, largely anecdotal, of American special operators observing SASR patrols in the field and being struck by their apparent lack of urgency. Patrols moved slowly. They stopped frequently. They seemed to spend as much time listening as moving, to observe as accustomed to the tempo of American operations. This looked less like reconnaissance and more like hesitation, but to those who understood the mission, it was something else entirely. It was discipline, carried to a level that most units could not sustain. One frequently cited story involves a joint operation in 1968, in which a SEAL platoon and an SASR patrol were tasked with observing the same general area from different positions. The SEAL platoon inserted, moved to its observation point, and spent 24 hours gathering intelligence before extracting. The SASR patrol inserted, established a covert position and remained in place for 9 days, when both units debriefed. The SEAL intelligence report covered enemy activity observed over a single day. The SASR report covered patterns of movement, identified command relationships, mapped supply routes, and provided a detailed assessment of enemy strength and disposition. Based on sustained observation, the story may be apocryphal, but it illustrates the difference in operational philosophy, and it explains why some American operators came to view the SASR with a mixture of respect and wariness. The Australians were not better in any absolute sense. They were not more courageous, but they were doing something that required a kind of psychological endurance that was difficult to quantify and difficult to replicate. There is also the question of lethality. The SASR did not rack up high body counts, They were not competing for confirmed kills, but when they did make contact, usually because a patrol had been compromised, the results were often devastating. SASR soldiers were trained to break contact quickly, using overwhelming firepower to suppress the enemy and create space for withdrawal. They carried claymore mines, grenades, and automatic weapons, and they knew how to use them. There are accounts of SASR patrols ambushing Viet Cong forces at close range, inflicting severe casualties and vanishing before reinforcements could. Arrived at this combination, extreme patience punctuated by sudden, overwhelming violence created an impression that was difficult to reconcile. To American operators, it seemed almost paradoxical. How could a unit that went to such lengths to avoid contact be so effective when contact occurred? The answer lay in the fact that the SASR was not avoiding contact out of fear. They were avoiding it because contact was tactically unnecessary. But when it became necessary, they were as prepared as any unit in the theater. This was not fear, but it was something that could be mistaken for fear, or at least for a kind of wariness, because the SASR did not fit neatly into the categories American operators used to understand special warfare. They were not raiders. They were not commandos in the traditional sense. They were something harder to define. Watchers who could kill, soldiers who fought by not fighting, operators whose greatest weapon was the enemy's ignorance of their presence, and in a war where clarity was rare and ambiguity was the norm. That kind of difference was unsettling even to men who were themselves operating at the edge of what conventional forces understood. But how much of this perception was based on actual observation, and how much was constructed through rumor, exaggeration, and the natural tendency of military subcultures to create legends around units they do not fully understand? Asterisk anecdote versus archive, assessing the claim, asterisk the claim that Navy SEALs feared the Australian SAS in Vietnam is not well documented in official sources. It does not appear in unit histories, operational summaries, or declassified intelligence assessments. There are no after-action reports that explicitly state that American special operators were wary of their Australian counterparts. What exists instead is a body of oral history, veteran testimony, and informal accounts that circulate within the special operations community. This does not mean the claim is false, but it does mean that it must be assessed carefully with an understanding of how reputations are built and how stories evolve over time. Military subcultures, particularly within elite units, are prone to myth-making. This is not unique to special operations, but it is especially pronounced in communities where operational security limits what can be said publicly and where success is often invisible to outsiders. In the absence of official recognition, soldiers create their own narratives, they tell stories, they compare units, they build hierarchies of respect that are sometimes based on objective performance, but are often based on perception, hearsay, and the weight of reputation. The SASR had a reputation in Vietnam. That much is undeniable. Australian infantry soldiers knew it, American advisors knew it, and within the special operations community, the reputation was specific. The SASR were patient, professional, and extraordinarily difficult to detect. They did not take unnecessary risks. They did not advertise their successes, and when they did engage, they did so with a level of precision and discipline that was unusual even by special operations standards. Asterisk, but reputation is not the same as fear. And the question of whether SEALs feared the SASR hinges on what we mean by that word. If fear means reluctance to operate in the same area, there is no evidence for it. SEALs and SASR patrols occasionally operated in adjacent provinces, and there is no record of American units requesting reassignment or expressing concern about Australian presence. If fear means anxiety about tactical competence, there is no evidence for that either. American operators respected the SASR, but respect is not fear. What is more plausible is that some American special operators were unsettled by the SASR's methods, not because they doubted their effectiveness, but because those methods were so different from what they had been trained to understand as effective. The SASR's emphasis on patience, on avoiding contact, on gathering intelligence rather than killing the enemy, ran counter to the American Special Operations ethos, and in a community where aggression, initiative, and direct action were celebrated, the SASR's restraint could seem almost alien. Asterisk, there is also the possibility that what has been described as fear was actually envy. The SASR had the luxury of operating in a single province under a unified command structure, with clear mission parameters and consistent support. They were not rotating through 6-month deployments. They were not under pressure to produce body counts. They were not competing for resources or recognition. They were simply doing their job and doing it well, without the political and institutional pressures that complicated American operations. Asterisk for SEAL operators, who were operating under those pressures, who were expected to produce results, to justify their presence, to compete with other units for missions and resources. The SASR's apparent freedom from those constraints might have seemed enviable, and envy in military communities is sometimes expressed as wariness. But none of this constitutes proof that SEALs feared the SASR. What it suggests instead is that the SASR occupied a unique position in the special operations landscape of the Vietnam War, close enough to be observed, different enough to be noticed, and effective enough to generate a reputation that outlasted the war itself. The most honest assessment is this: the claim that SEALs feared the SASR is an exaggeration, but it is an exaggeration rooted in something real. The SASR were different. Their methods were different, and in a war where difference was often the only thing that separated success from failure, that difference mattered. What, then, can the archival record confirm? And what remains in the realm of perception, memory, and the stories soldiers tell each other when the official histories have been written? Asterisk what the record confirms and what it cannot. Asterisk the archival record of the Vietnam War is vast, fragmented, and unevenly preserved. Official histories exist for most major units. After-action reports document significant operations. Intelligence summaries track enemy activity and allied responses, but the record is incomplete, particularly when it comes to special operations, where classification, operational security, and institutional reluctance to document sensitive activities have left gaps that will never be filled. What the record confirms about the SASR in Vietnam is this: they were highly effective reconnaissance operators. They conducted hundreds of patrols between 1966 and 1971. They provided intelligence that enabled successful operations by the 1st Australian Task Force. They suffered relatively few casualties despite operating in high-threat environments, and they were respected by the Australian command structure as a critical asset in the effort to dominate Phnic Province. What the record confirms about SEAL operations in Vietnam is this: they conducted thousands of missions, primarily in the Mekong Delta and the Rung Sat Special Zone. They killed and captured large numbers of Viet Cong. They disrupted enemy logistics and infrastructure. They took significant casualties but maintained operational tempo throughout the war, and they were regarded by American commanders as one of the most effective unconventional warfare assets in the theater. What the record does not confirm is any systematic interaction between SEAL teams and SASR patrols. There are no joint operations documented in publicly available sources. There are no intelligence exchanges that suggest ongoing collaboration. There are no command-level discussions that address the relationship between the two units. This absence is not surprising. The SEALs and the SASR operated under different command structures, in different provinces with different missions. There was no institutional reason for them to interact on a regular basis, and operational security would have discouraged informal coordination. The fact that they rarely worked together does not mean they were unaware of each other, but it does mean that any perception of fear, wariness, or professional comparison would have been based on limited direct observation. What the record also does not confirm, and this is important, is any evidence that the SASR were feared by anyone. There are no complaints from Viet Cong prisoners about Australian patrols. There are no captured documents that single out the SASR as a particular threat. There are no intelligence assessments that suggest the enemy altered their behavior in response to SASR presence in ways that differed from their response to other reconnaissance units. This does not mean the SASR were ineffective. It means that their effectiveness was, by design, invisible. A successful SASR patrol was one that the enemy never knew was there. The intelligence it gathered might lead to an airstrike, an artillery barrage, or an infantry sweep, but the patrol itself would remain undetected. And an enemy who does not know you are watching cannot fear you. So where does that leave the claim? If the record does not confirm it, and if the conditions that would produce it are ambiguous, why does the story persist? The answer may lie in the nature of military memory. Soldiers remember what was unusual. They remember what stood out. And in a war where most units operated according to recognizable patterns, the SASR's methods were unusual. They stood out, and in the years since the war, as veterans have shared stories, compared experiences, and constructed narratives about what they saw and what they heard, the SASR's reputation has been amplified, refined, and, in some cases, mythologized. This is not unique to the SASR. Every war produces legends. Every elite unit generates stories that exceed the documented record. The question is not whether the stories are true in a literal sense, but whether they point to something true about the experience of the war itself. And in the case of the SASR and the SEALs, what the stories point to is this: there was more than one way to fight in Vietnam. The American approach high-tempo, direct action. Maximum firepower was effective in certain contexts. The Australian approach patience, intelligence, economy of force was effective in others. Neither was superior in an absolute sense, but they were different, and that difference was profound enough to generate a perception that has outlasted the war itself. What remains, then, is not proof of fear, but evidence of difference. And in a war where difference often determines survival, that evidence matters. Allied elites and the limits of reputation. The Vietnam War was many wars fought simultaneously. It was a conventional conflict between North Vietnamese regulars and American and South Vietnamese forces. It was a guerrilla insurgency waged by the Viet Cong against the government of South Vietnam. It was a test of competing doctrines, technologies, and strategies, and within that broader war, there were smaller wars fought by reconnaissance patrols, special operations teams, and intelligence units whose missions were invisible to the public, and often invisible to the conventional forces. They supported the Australian Special Air Service Regiment for one of those smaller wars. They operated in the margins, in the spaces where conventional forces could not go and where the enemy believed himself safe. They gathered intelligence, tracked movements, and enabled operations that disrupted Viet Cong control of Phuoc Thu province. They did not seek recognition. They did not compete for headlines. They simply did their job, and they did it with a level of professionalism that earned the respect of those who understood what they were doing. The United States Navy SEALs fought a different small war. They conducted raids, snatched prisoners, destroyed infrastructure, and imposed a cost on the Viet Cong that forced the enemy to divert resources to security. They operated at a tempo that was relentless, and they paid a price for it in casualties and exhaustion. But they also achieved results that were measurable, tangible, and in many cases decisive. The claim that SEALs feared the SASR is, at best, an oversimplification. There is no documentary evidence that American special operators feared their Australian counterparts in any conventional sense. What the evidence does suggest is that the SASR's methods were sufficiently different and sufficiently effective that they generated a reputation within the special operations community, a reputation rooted in respect, curiosity, and perhaps a degree of professional unease. That reputation was not fear, but it was something. It was an acknowledgement that in war there are many forms of lethality, and that patience can be as dangerous as aggression. It was a recognition that the enemy you cannot see is, in some ways, more dangerous than the enemy you can fight, and it was a reminder that even within the community of elite warriors, there are gradations of skill, discipline, and operational philosophy that defy easy comparison. The SASR in Vietnam were not mythical. They were soldiers doing difficult work under difficult conditions. With the tools and training they had been given, they succeeded because they were patient, because they were disciplined, and because they understood that the mission was not glory but intelligence. They left behind a record that is fragmentary, a reputation that is contested, and a legacy that continues to shape how special operations are understood and practiced. The SEALs in Vietnam were not inferior. They were conducting a different mission under different constraints with different objectives. They succeeded because they were aggressive, because they were adaptable, and because they understood that the mission was to disrupt, destroy, and impose a cost on the enemy that could not be sustained. What the case of the SASR and the SEALs reveals is not a hierarchy of capability, but a spectrum of approach. It reveals that in counterinsurgency, there is no single correct method. It reveals that allies fighting the same war can fight it in fundamentally different ways and both be right. And it reveals that reputation in war is built not just on what you do but on how you do it, and that sometimes the quietest soldiers leave the loudest echoes. The Vietnam War ended decades ago. The men who fought in it are aging. The units have rotated through other conflicts, other missions, other wars. But the story of how they fought and why they fought the way they did remains a subject of study, debate, and occasionally myth. The truth about whether SEALs feared the SASR is probably simpler and more human than the legend suggests. They did not fear them, but they noticed them, they respected them, and in a war where respect was hard-earned and rarely given, that was no small thing.